Hi, everyone. Welcome to Pipeline, the show where I interview creative and innovative people and learn about some of their projects. On this episode, my guest is Amy Saxton Shaw, President and CEO of Nine Network in St. Louis. Amy, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much, Scott. Great to be here.
Great to see you again. It's been a while. We both,
Very long time.
Yeah, out of Carbondale. Great to see you, old friend. And let me tell you a little bit about what we do here at Pipeline. I ask people like you who are doing creative and innovative things 3 questions. First, what's a recent project you're proud of or had challenges with in the past 5 years, 10 years? Second question is, what are you doing now? What project are you working on? And then, what's coming down the pipeline? So, what are you looking forward to in the future? So with that, I'll start with the first question. What's something in the last 5 or 10 years that you've been proud of or have seen as challenge or has been meaningful to you?
Oh my gosh. So our Nine Network is the PBS affiliate serving the St. Louis region. And as a PBS station, we do a lot of things that people know about, which are, the great programming, Masterpiece, Antiques Roadshow, the kids programs. But the reason public television was created in the first place was really about serving community needs and being that community institution that helps incent conversations, address big issues. And so we in St. Louis, a little over 10 years ago, became very enamored with the idea of engagement, community engagement, what that meant, and how we would do our work differently. And we're fortunate to be a part of an initiative that was funded by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, where we got to be lab rats, essentially, in what that would look like, how a station would transform. And we were actually really a star pupil. And so I was in charge of that work, and that really charted the course of my career, moving from a VP in the organization to then ultimately the number 2 person in the organization, and really making our organization anchored by this idea of what was important to the community, and then making all of our work flow from that perspective and making everybody's jobs focused on the community. And that's not an easy thing to do. But where we were most successful is really looking at how a public media organization addresses big issues in the community. And so there's an initiative called American Graduate that we actually created. It was informed by prior work that we had done on other issues, but it's basically anchored by a model, which is very simple. And it is understand what's important to the community through the people that are doing the work on the ground and through the people who are impacted by those issues. So both and then create content based on that information and that constant engagement with those stakeholders and partners, and then assess what the impact of that content is through all the distribution channels, what happens in terms of awareness, action, community level change, and then lather, rinse, repeat, and keep doing it. And so American Graduate evolved from addressing the high school graduation crisis, these dropout factories that were in communities across the country. And so we led that work in St. Louis, both doing the work on the ground in St. Louis with key partners and community members and kids, and then leading that across the country with about 100 public television stations over the course of a decade. And then over the last 2 years, that work evolved from what happens in high school to then what happens after high school, because the realization of the pipeline is, pun intended for the program, the pipeline is kids graduate from high school and they basically are supposed to go to college, right? And for you and me, that was definitely the pathway, and that was a good pathway, and it worked. But for a lot of kids, that is not what they want to do, or they don't know what they want to do, or they can't afford it. And something like 44%, 46% of young people go off to college, and then within the first 2 years, they come home without a degree and with a mountain of debt. And, college is so expensive. But this pendulum really swung in this direction of you have to go to college. And meanwhile, our companies, both in St. Louis and in communities across the country, are clamoring for skilled workers in the IT space, healthcare, skilled trades, coding, a whole bunch of high demand skilled careers. And so how do we help our community understand that those are real viable careers? And while kids aren't necessarily thinking about it, the influencers in their lives are thinking about it, like their parents, their educators, the influencers. And if the influencers believe the only way to do it is to go to college, then the kid's going to go that pathway. And so we have made some real headwind in terms of bringing about awareness and perception change about the world of work, which has been great. And public television has really cemented itself as an essential institution in local communities, in those communities where we've been working with the public television stations, so that not only could they address this issue, but they could address other really systemic issues in their community. So not just putting forth great programming, but really being at the epicenter of things that are plaguing and challenging and mitigating progress in local communities.
Mm-hmm. So how did that affect your programming? How did it change your programming?
That's a great question. So, we have a core of local producers, and so they work right beside our engagement staff. They're basically part of the same team, so that they're listening to what our partners and community members are saying about these things, and then they're creating content accordingly. So basically what we're doing is we're flooding our air and our digital channels with content, stories that tell the specific aspects of those issues. So what's going to help create that level of change? It's showing real people doing these real jobs, kids that have gotten jobs out of high school, say for Ameren, the electric utility in St. Louis, who are really filling high demand skilled careers, both helping the economy, their own economy, in terms of basically buying houses at age 19, and also helping our regional economy versus going into a low paying dead end job, or going to college if they didn't want to go to college or couldn't pay for college, or just any manner of those things. And so the content really is the steady drumbeat of stories that help people understand and align with that set of goals. So essentially, if you were watching 9 today, we have 4 channels. And so across those 4 channels, we would put messaging in between programs, interstitial content, 30 to 60-second messages that are not promotional, rather they're telling stories that help people achieve awareness, understanding, action around the issue at hand. And then town halls and specials and packages in our magazine programs and news and public affairs specials. So really just flooding our air with the branding of the initiative, but also the issues at hand in the initiative. So basically turning on our air, you would see American Graduate pretty steadily.
Mm-hmm. And how do you measure, how do you assess how the message is being received?
Yeah, so we do that a couple different ways. So I have a colleague, and we were pretty early onto this idea of having an evaluation director on staff versus working with external evaluators, simply because in public media, we can't generally afford that. It's super expensive. And so having a colleague on staff who's tasked with being with us at every step along the way to help us understand how we should structure the work, how we should measure it then. And so they're not being brought at the end. They're basically with us on the journey to help align the work accordingly. And so we're measuring it from a couple different perspectives. What's the impact on partners? So we have a network in St. Louis of 60 plus partners that are with us on American Graduate. So we're measuring what happens with them. Are they seeing any changes with their constituents? Are they seeing changes in awareness, perception change, action, understanding? What is the value to them of the work? And then we're also doing community-wide surveys based on sort of what we call it a poor man's random sample, but based on our membership base and our email base, which we have an email list of about 90,000 people who've opted in. Some of them are members. Some of them have just, they've opted in for a promotional message, and they respond to surveys based on what they've seen, what they've done with the information. Has it changed their perception and awareness? And then periodically we're able to have a little bit of money to do more community-wide surveys, but basically those serve as proxies, the surveys that we're doing with our membership and our supporters, if you will. And granted, we know that they're consuming our content more often than others, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily watching us on air. They may be getting it via social channels or digital channels. So that's how we're assessing it.
Well, I'm so glad to hear you have an in-house evaluator. I'm an external evaluator, And one of the challenging things is not being there from the beginning planning
Yeah.
stages.
Yeah. It's really hard.
Yeah. So I'm very happy to hear you have somebody there who's an expert and knows how to guide you in those measures. That's cool. So next question. What is a current project that you're working on that you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, so I'm gonna offer two. One is an expansion of American Graduate. So we're really well poised, given the significant job losses in our country. Some of those job losses are going to be temporary. We understand that. Some of those sectors, though, are simply not going to come back. They were tenuous at best. Retail, other sectors, the restaurant scene, we're going to be really challenged with our economy for a while to come, both at the local level and at the state and national level. So American Graduate is really well poised to pivot from focusing on 16 to 26-year-olds to focusing on those who've been displaced in this crisis. And so using that network of partners and using that ability to create content at scale and distribute content at scale to help people understand where resources are, where jobs are, where the sectors are going, where those high demand careers are, so that we can get people back to work both in the short term and the long term. So that's one really significant thing, and we'll be really at that for the foreseeable future and then some. The second thing has been in relation to the crisis as well, in that very early on when we saw that schools were going to start closing, it became very clear to us that as public television, we had a role to play there. So most public television stations were started in response to helping the education needs of learners across the community. Teachers would drag a TV set in the room and there would be somebody who would teach on TV. And that was, that's how we started. And so realizing very quickly that in our community, in the 5 metro counties, the biggest counties, there's about 30,000 kids that don't have access to either devices or reliable internet. And so you're talking about 30,000 kids who are likely already behind in the first place, who are going to slide further behind. So how could we take the equity question off the table and make instruction equitable and accessible to everybody in our community, every kid? So we talked to education leaders very early on, and they said 3 key things. One was, we're very concerned about our younger learners, pre-K through 4. They're not used to distance learning. It's going to be harder for them. 2, we're really concerned about equity, those kids that don't have access to devices or internet. And 3, we're really concerned about parents, because they're going to be freaking out about all this. It's really, this is a lift. And I think parents certainly can appreciate what a lift it has been, especially if you're working at the same time. So what we did twofold was we created a toolkit for educators and learners and parents and caregivers that's readily accessible online, with a trove of resources from PBS Kids, standards aligned, curricular areas outlined, activities, things that parents could go to both on air and online and on devices. And then the second thing we did was work with our region's educators and select a core of 12 teachers who are teaching on TV every day for 2 hours. And we're working on math and literacy, because that's where we were told the greatest gaps were. We took our guidance from the State Department of Elementary and Secondary Education and their staff. So it's a very collaborative process. And what we've been doing is having teachers teach on Zoom, basically, taped those lessons and then put them on TV for 2 hours every day. We're launching now next week science lessons on Fridays. And then we're also doing storytelling on Fridays as well. And so that's going to continue through the summer, because we know so many kids are not going to be in summer camps. Summer schools are going to look very different, and parents are still going to need these resources. Mm-hmm. So whether you have access to devices or not, or whether you're just a parent who really needs a break and is, needing some resources to help your kids learn, TV is a really viable option. So that's really something that we've been doing. We're very proud of it. It's really garnered a lot of good attention, and people are really using it. We have daily ratings, so we can see that about 6,000 kids a day are using that service.
Wow. And if I'm a parent in Houston, Texas, can I access that information?
You cannot.
Okay.
So Two reasons. One, some of the materials are copyrighted, and so we're not able to stream them just yet.
Okay.
We are working to try to get the copyright to stream. However, your great friends at Houston Public Media, which is a great television and radio network, your public television and radio network, led by the great Lisa Shoemate, my good friend. They're doing a lot of education work. So if you go to their website, they have a lot of good resources as well. And you should be able to access those resources. Yeah, so a lot of public television stations are doing this kind of work. Everybody's doing it a little differently, which is actually a good thing because it's based on the needs of the community, which is really going back to what we started 10, 12 years ago, this idea of really listening to what's important to the community to inform your work. We could have gone out immediately and said, okay, we're gonna really help educators, we're gonna help parents, but it may not have been the right work. And so listening to what's important and then calibrating work accordingly and then continuing to recalibrate that work, that's who we are.
Nice. That's awesome to hear. And then I know I have colleagues and friends who are stressed out about, not just teaching their children at this time, but keeping them busy and active. And some of them have 4 kids. And how do you juggle that?
I don't know how you do it because we don't have kids. We have a dog and a cat. While you and I have been talking, the cat has been pacing back and forth in front of me and needing attention, which is nothing compared to 4 children. And then periodically, our dog is outside right now, but yesterday he was really insistent that he needed our attention and needed me to be either throwing the ball for him. And so if he's inside, he's kind of pawing at me. If he's outside, he wants attention. My husband's downstairs teaching. And that's just a dog. So I don't know how with children who are vocal and, we have a lot of staff, 30% of our staff have kids at home, school-age kids at home. And it's a lot. It's just a lot. So I think people are going through a lot right now. And there's a lot of good that comes out of it, but there's also a lot of stress.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you and your organization offer that option. That's awesome.
Yeah, we have a great team that's made that happen. I'm really proud.
Nice. Question number 3.
Okay.
So what's coming down the pipeline? What's the project coming up that you're really excited about?
Well, so to sort of tie a bow around all of that, it's this jobs in the economy piece. I've been calling it what's next. That's not what we're going to call it, but it goes back to something we did over 10 years ago, which was in response to the global financial crisis. It was called Facing the Mortgage Crisis, and it was really the foundation of everything we do now, which is this engagement model and understanding what's important to communities and connecting people to trusted resources. And so the what's next is how do we really adjust to the new normal in our communities? What jobs in the economy is a piece of it, the changing face of education. So many things are changing. And then wrap around that this idea of, and maybe not everybody sees it this way, but I worry as a country we've lost our collective will and our collectivism in terms of rising tide floats all boats, and that if you're in this, I'm in this, and what happens to you happens to me. I don't think we are getting that clearly, and I'm concerned about that. And so our staff is working on a pretty wide scale initiative of how do we address all of that from a content perspective, but listening to our community to inform our content, not just sitting around the table and saying, what would be interesting, but listening to our community. So we're pulling together a group of people that we've worked with on other projects, partners, trusted people in the community who are doing good work, to pull them together virtually to say kind of what's next. Where do we need to go? What are the biggest issues you're seeing? I think the ideas of equity and disparity have been laid bare by this crisis, and we have a big role to play. I think focusing our energies, that's something that I've been working on very carefully in terms of how do we use our staff's resources and time and energy in this time so that it is most effective and that we are most relevant. Because, let's be honest, the financial crisis is here. And we're a philanthropically supported organization. We don't know what the future looks like. We don't know what next year looks like. So how do we do our best and highest work for and with our community so that we are relevant and supported and that our community comes out of this looking better than they went coming in. And this is, St. Louis, I think, likes to think that we're the only ones facing this. Communities across the country are facing this in terms of economic disparities, minority health disparities, disparity. And so I think we really have something that we could do differently and come out of this differently in St. Louis. So that's kind of what we're thinking about. And we're also thinking about how we get our people back to work in the building, but also we're not going to rush that. We're going to go very, very slow and continue this remote work and keep everybody safe and healthy and well in the process.
So have you, with your organization and working remotely, have you already begun the exercise of how are things going to change moving forward?
Absolutely. Yeah, we have working a plan through the rest of the summer. So what looks different this summer now, between now and the end of August, essentially, which is somewhat arbitrary, but also related to a lot of our staff who have kids are going to be dealing with no childcare, no summer school, no camps. So what does that look like for them? And so one of the things is changing of much more flexible work hours. If you want to work Saturday, Sunday and be off Monday, Tuesday, great. Let's figure that out. Not mandating that, but what if it works for you? We are a highly collaborative organization, so we do have to figure out how that looks. But I think we've already figured out collaboration in the age of virtual engagement here. And we're also figuring out what physically our workspaces look like. So we have very much a pod and hive setup, a lot of open workspaces, which now is not what we need. And so how to break those apart so that people have more physical space. It's a good thing, but it's also a little challenging. We've started to embark on a massive building renovation. Our building is 22 years old and needs some updating. And it was built at a time where we were very much a television station. And that's true, but right now and in the future, we're very much a community institution that happens to be a media company. And so what does that look like for our building? We engage a lot of people physically in our building. 25,000 people came through our building for events last year. Right. And so what does that look like now? And we're embarking on that. The plans are in place. And so now looking at that with the lens of, all right, one, how do we fund that? Two, how do we make sure that it's what people really need now and in the future? And how does that look different? So, listen, crisis is kind of a great thing in some ways, that it gives us fresh eyes and gives us the opportunity to throw off ways of doing and being and thinking that weren't as productive for us. And so, we're thinking about all that. All of that is open.
Wow. Lots will change. Lots
will change.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Amy, thank you so much for being on Pipeline. I really appreciate it. It's so good to see you again and hearing about the great things you're doing in my old stomping ground, growing up in the St. Louis area. It sounds like the organization's doing great, and you're doing great, and you're doing great things for the community. That's
Thanks.
awesome.
It's a great place to be. I'm really proud to be there. And I'm from St. Louis originally too. So it's great to be in your hometown and, being with the people who are doing such great things and have such care for the community. So thanks for letting me talk about that.
Thank you so much, Amy. We'll talk again.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.